Hi guys, this is Mrs. Holmer, and I'm just going to do a quick review of cellular respiration to remind you of all the steps of the process. So if you remember in cellular respiration, we are breaking down glucose slowly and we're capturing the energy released by glucose to produce ATP energy or usable energy for the cell. So if you notice here, we have our formula for cellular respiration. We're going to take in glucose and oxygen as our reactants. And then we're going to produce carbon dioxide, water, and energy in the form of ATP as our products. Remember, we're going to use these electron carriers to help us capture the energy of the electrons and take them to the electron transport chain. So those are going to be NAD positive, which is going to turn into NADH, and FAD, which will turn into FADH2. And these are going to be really important, especially when we talk about the electron transport chain. Now, the process of cellular respiration can be in two different ways. We are looking at the aerobic pathway, which is going to occur with oxygen and the mitochondria. And there's an anaerobic pathway, which is going to occur without oxygen, which you should be looking at later in a Nearpod. So let's review the steps of aerobic respiration. Number 1 is glycolysis. Number 2 is the Krebs cycle or citric acid cycle. And number 3 is the ETC and chemiosmosis, or what we call oxidative phosphorylation. So here's a picture, an overview of this. Glycolysis happening outside of the mitochondria, the Krebs cycle happening in the matrix of the mitochondria, and finally that third step, the oxidative phosphorylation or the electron transport chain, happening within the folds of the cristae. And again, that's why we folded up the cristae, is to get more surface area for that process to occur. So let's see what happens in each step. As a reminder, the first step is glycolysis. This can happen with anaerobic and aerobic respiration because it does not use oxygen. So it's always going to start cellular respiration. And this is going to happen outside of the mitochondria because it doesn't need oxygen. So this is happening in the cytoplasm. And you'll see here, just simply we're taking glucose and breaking it down slowly. In this process, we use ATP and we produce it. So we're netting, overall, we're getting 2 ATP, which is great. It's a little taste of ATP that we can use for our energy needs. We're also capturing some high energy electrons on our electron carriers, NAD positive and NADH. So we're catching it on NAD positive, we're making NADH, and we're taking those electron carriers to the electron transport chain. From there, we're going to enter the Krebs cycle. So now we're getting into the mitochondria. Now, again, this can only happen. Your ticket into the mitochondria is with oxygen. So you cannot get into the Krebs cycle if you do not have oxygen available. And so the Krebs cycle is happening in the matrix, the very center of the mitochondria. And we're slowly breaking down glucose further. So we're actually starting with that pyruvic acid that we ended with in glycolysis. And we're going to slowly break it down so as not to lose too much energy to heat. Some of it will be lost to heat to fuel your body and heat your body and keep it at that consistent temperature around 98 degrees. But a lot of it needs to be captured so we can take that energy and make ATP. So at the beginning, we start with a chemical called citric acid, which is why it's also known as the citric acid cycle. And we're going to just do lots of chemical reactions. And during these reactions, we're going to release certain things. First, we'll release carbon dioxide. This will be our waste product, and that will diffuse out. Then we're going to capture some electrons on NADH. We're going to produce just a taste of ATP. And finally, we're going to capture some more electrons on FAD to make it FADH2. Now, this is going to turn twice because there's 2 pyruvic acids that were made at the end of glycolysis. So overall, we made a little ATP, we made some carbon dioxide as waste, but we caught a lot of electrons to be used at the last step. Now, this step is actually really complicated, so let's just be grateful we don't have to learn all these names and all these steps. Lastly, we're going to do what we call ETC and chemiosmosis, or oxidative phosphorylation. So this is a 2-step process in order to make that big bang of ATP. So we're going to start with the ETC. This is located in the cristae. It is a series of proteins and protein pumps that power active transport. I'm going to go to this larger image so you can see this. We're going to take these hydrogen ions and we're going to try to actively pump them from low to high. To do that, my electron carriers need to drop off their electrons. These electrons will travel through the electron transport chain, and their energy will be used for that active transport to pump the hydrogens across the membrane. At the end of the electron transport chain, those electrons will be joined with oxygen to make water. So if we don't have oxygen, the electrons don't get dropped off, the hydrogens don't get pumped up, and the whole system shuts down, which will also inadvertently shut down the Krebs cycle. So again, you cannot get into the mitochondria without oxygen. So at the end, when we've joined our electrons with our oxygen, we've made water. So now the electrons are chilling with the oxygen, and we're left with this high concentration of hydrogen ions on the other side. So after the electron transport chain, what's going to happen is chemiosmosis, where these hydrogens, since they're in such high concentration, are going to diffuse through facilitated diffusion through this molecule called an ATP synthase, causing it to spin. And when it does, it takes that phosphate, it slams it back onto ADP to make ATP. Remember, to make ATP, you had to add energy to it. And that energy is coming from these hydrogen ions going through this molecule and spinning it. And so we're energizing ADP to make ATP. We'll make somewhere between 32 and 36 ATP, depending on the conditions. But that's a lot of ATP energy from that glucose molecule we started with. Now, we could have hypothetically made 90 ATP, but we've lost some of that energy as heat, which is good. It fuels our body and keeps us at a good temperature. But we do get a big bang at the end here in the electron transport chain in chemiosmosis, step 3. So overall, the name can be called oxidative phosphorylation because with oxygen getting those electrons off of the ETC, we can add a phosphate to ADP. That's what phosphorylation is, to make ATP. And that is the final step of cellular respiration. So again, does this require oxygen? Glycolysis does not, but because of the need for oxygen in the ETC, the Krebs cycle and the third step, oxidative phosphorylation, both require oxygen. You cannot get into the mitochondria without it. So if you really want that huge outpouring of ATP, you have to have an oxygenated situation. So if you take a look here, I've got kind of broke down of what happens in each step. Glycolysis in the cytoplasm, it takes in glucose, it captures energy on NADH and produces 2 ATP without oxygen. The Krebs cycle occurs in the matrix. It breaks down pyruvic acid a little further. It produces carbon dioxide as waste. It captures those electrons on both electron carriers, produces 2 ATP, but does indirectly require oxygen. And lastly, the ETC in chemiosmosis occurs in the cristae. It does take all the electrons that were on our electron carriers. Remember, I called them our Uber drivers, and it drops those electrons off. These electrons fuel the making of ATP, so we have to take in oxygen. We'll produce water. We'll produce somewhere between 32, 36 ATP, and it does directly require oxygen. The other thing you're going to recycle is NAD plus and FAD will be recycled back to glycolysis and the Krebs cycle. So this is the aerobic pathway of cellular respiration. It's kind of complicated, but it will net us somewhere between 36 and 38 ATP overall, which is a good amount of ATP for our cells. All right, if you have any other questions, please let me know, but that is the aerobic cellular respiration cycle. Have a good rest of your day.